In the summer of 1946, a French swimsuit designer named his new invention after a tiny coral atoll in the Pacific that most people had never heard of. He said it would be just as explosive as what the US military had just done there. He wasn't exaggerating for effect. 4 days earlier, the United States had detonated a nuclear weapon on that same atoll, the first of 23 it would set off there over the next 12 years. The atoll was called Bikini, and before the world turned its name into a punchline for beachwear, it was home to a small community of people who were never really given a choice about any of what was coming. This is the story of Bikini Atoll, how a quiet ring of islands in the Marshall Islands became the most nuclear-tested place on Earth, how its people were displaced not once but 3 separate times chasing a promise of return that kept falling apart, and how, decades later, the ocean quietly did something almost nobody expected. Let's start with who was actually living there. In early 1946, Bikini Atoll was home to about 167 people, roughly 40 families. Spread across a ring of coral islands surrounding a lagoon in the Marshall Islands, then a Pacific territory administered by the United States. In February of that year, the American military governor of the Marshall Islands asked the residents, led by their leader King Judah, whether they'd be willing to temporarily leave their home so the United States could test atomic weapons there, described to them as being for the good of mankind and to end all world wars. According to accounts from the time, King Judah answered with something close to resignation, "We will go," believing that everything is in the hands of God. Within weeks, the entire population was loaded onto a Navy ship and moved 125 miles east to a smaller, far less fertile atoll called Rongerik. They were told it would be temporary. It wasn't temporary in any sense that mattered. Rongerik couldn't support them. Not enough food, not enough drinkable water. Within about 2 years, the relocated Bikinians were approaching starvation. Rather than send them home, the U.S. moved them again in 1948, this time to Kwajalein Atoll, where they were housed in tents beside a military airstrip while officials tried to figure out what to do with them. Later that same year, they were relocated a 3rd time to Kili Island, a single isolated island with no lagoon and almost no protected fishing grounds. For a culture built entirely around lagoon navigation and fishing, this was devastating. Many Bikinians consider this move, not the first one, the real destruction of their way of life. And all of that happened before the testing program had even gotten started in earnest. Operation Crossroads, the first series of tests at Bikini, began on July 1, 1946, with the Bikinians barely off the atoll. The first test, Able, detonated an atomic bomb over a fleet of nearly 100 obsolete and captured warships anchored in the lagoon, positioned there deliberately to see what a nuclear weapon would do to a navy. It missed its aim point by somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 feet, a reminder of just how imprecise early nuclear delivery still was. 3 weeks later came Baker, the first underwater nuclear detonation in history. It sent a wall of water surging nearly 100 feet into the air, briefly lifting a 27,000-ton battleship clean out of the water. The chemist who helped oversee the tests, Glenn Seaborg, later called Baker the world's first nuclear disaster for how thoroughly it contaminated every ship in the lagoon with radioactive seawater. A 3rd test, Charlie, was actually planned and then quietly canceled. Military planners decided it wasn't worth the resources, at a moment when the U.S. was trying to shift toward building smaller, more practical weapons instead. Which brings us back to that swimsuit. 4 days after the Able test made headlines around the world, French designer Louis Réard unveiled a scandalously small 2-piece swimsuit at a Paris pool party. No professional model would agree to wear it, so he hired a nude cabaret dancer, Micheline Bernardini, instead. He called it the Bikini, gambling that it would be just as culturally explosive as the news that had just come out of that Pacific atoll. The Vatican called it sinful. Several U.S. states tried to ban it in public. It caught on anyway, and today, almost nobody who wears one connects the name to where it actually came from. Back at the atoll, the testing didn't stop with Crossroads. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 23 nuclear devices at Bikini across 4 separate test series: Crossroads, Castle, Red Wing, and Hardtack, with a combined explosive yield estimated around 77 megatons. For scale, that's more than 1,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs aimed at one small ring of islands. The single worst of those tests, by far, came on March 1, 1954. Its name was Castle Bravo, and it remains the most powerful nuclear device the United States has ever detonated. Bravo was designed as a hydrogen bomb test, and scientists predicted a yield of around 6 megatons. What they got was 2.5 times more powerful than planned. The miscalculation traced back to a basic assumption about a form of lithium used in the bomb's fuel. Designers had assumed a particular lithium isotope, lithium-7, would behave passively inside the weapon. Instead, when struck by high-energy neutrons, it split apart and released far more fuel for the reaction than anyone had accounted for, turning a large hydrogen bomb into something closer to a runaway chain reaction. The blast vaporized an entire island and carved a crater more than a mile wide and roughly 250 feet deep into the reef. And because the explosion was so much bigger than modeled, its radioactive fallout cloud, nearly 100 miles wide, went places nobody had planned for. Prevailing winds carried a fine, snow-like radioactive ash eastward, blanketing inhabited atolls that hadn't been evacuated because nobody expected fallout to travel that far. Rongelap, roughly 110 miles from ground zero, took the heaviest hit. Fallout began reaching Rongelap within about 12 to 15 hours of the blast. Residents, with no idea what it was, went about their day. As it settled, children reportedly played in what looked like snow. It would be 2 more days before a Navy ship arrived to evacuate them. Within days, people were suffering hair loss, skin lesions, and radiation burns. Thyroid tumors and other radiation-linked illnesses would keep appearing in islanders for decades afterward. The fallout reached even further than that. Roughly 80 miles from the blast, just outside the Navy's own declared danger zone, a Japanese fishing trawler called the Daigo Fukuryu Maru, the Lucky Dragon 5, was showered in the same radioactive ash. All 23 crew members developed acute radiation sickness. The boat's chief radio man, Eikichi Kuboyama, died about 6 months later. The incident became an international scandal. Japan, the only country to have suffered a wartime nuclear attack, was now watching its own fishermen sicken from an American test conducted thousands of miles from Japanese waters. The U.S. eventually paid Japan roughly $15 million in compensation, though for years the surviving fishermen were denied official recognition as atomic bomb survivors. Altogether, the U.S. Department of Energy has estimated that more than 250 Marshall Islands residents were directly affected by Bravo's fallout. Decades later, a nuclear claims tribunal would award over $43 million to more than 1,000 Marshallese claimants for radiation-linked illnesses. So that's the testing program. Now here's the part of the story that, for the Bikinians themselves, mattered even more: the promise of finally going home. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson announced that Bikini was safe again and that its exiled people could finally return. It had been 22 years since King Judah's family and neighbors had left, believing that everything is in the hands of God. Around 100 Bikinians moved back starting in 1972, replanting coconut trees and rebuilding homes, trying to restart a life that had effectively been paused for a generation. It didn't last. Scientists monitoring the resettled community discovered the well water contained dangerously high levels of strontium-90, a radioactive isotope that mimics calcium and concentrates in bone. Worse, tests on the returned residents themselves showed cesium-137 levels in their bodies had climbed roughly 11-fold in just a few years. The coconuts and local produce they were eating were quietly re-poisoning them. In September 1978, the U.S. government evacuated the resettled Bikinians for a second time. They had believed they were finally home. They had, without knowing it, been living on some of the most contaminated ground on the planet. Nobody has permanently resettled Bikini Atoll since. Today, only a small caretaker staff, usually somewhere between 4 and 6 people, lives there at any given time, mostly supporting the very occasional dive tourism trip to the sunken target fleet still resting in the lagoon. The rest of the Bikinian people and their descendants, around 5,400 by a mid-2010s count, are scattered across the Marshall Islands and beyond. Several hundred still on cramped, lagoonless Kili Island, a couple thousand in the capital Majuro, others on nearby Egypt Island, and well over 1,000 who eventually relocated to the United States. The U.S. has paid out compensation in stages over the decades. A trust fund in the 1970s, a resettlement fund in the 1980s that grew toward $80 million by the 2010s, and tens of millions more allocated specifically for cleanup. On paper, it looks like a substantial settlement for what was taken. In practice, more recent history hasn't been kind to that money either. In 2017, local leadership loosened restrictions on how the Resettlement Trust Fund could be spent. Within 6 years, a fund that had held around $59 million had been drawn down to just over $100,000, spent partly on real estate and vehicles that generated no return, and basic services to Keeley Island were suspended, prompting a formal state of emergency. So a people exiled from their home for a weapons program that treated their islands as a laboratory, moved 3 times before the worst of the tests had even happened, promised a return that ended up poisoning a second generation, and left, generations later, still fighting over what remains of the compensation for all of it. That's most of the human story. But there's a strange, almost hopeful coda to Bikini Atoll that historians and marine scientists didn't expect to find. In 2023, a National Geographic Pristine Seas survey dove into Bikini's lagoon and reef, the same lagoon that had absorbed 23 nuclear detonations across 12 years, including the most powerful bomb the U.S. has ever built. What they found was a coral reef in remarkably good health, in areas where the physical reef structure had survived the blasts. Researchers reported coral cover, essentially matching pre-test surveys from the 1940s. Roughly 70% of the original coral species had repopulated the site, with some replaced by new arrivals carried in on ocean currents from neighboring atolls. Even more strikingly, Bikini's waters now show a noticeably higher abundance of reef fish and sharks than most comparable reefs elsewhere in the Pacific, a strong sign of ecological health, since apex predators are usually among the first things to disappear from a damaged ecosystem. It's not a clean bill of health. Soil and groundwater on the islands remain contaminated enough that nobody can safely live there long-term without extensive remediation. Researchers estimate you'd need to strip away roughly 6 inches of topsoil and treat crops with potassium, just to bring radiation levels down to something survivable. And the marine biologists who dove the reef were careful to note that surviving a nuclear blast is one thing. Surviving repeated ocean heat waves driven by a warming climate is a very different test, and possibly a harder one, that's really only just getting started. So Bikini Atoll sits today in a strange kind of limbo, a lagoon that nature has spent 70 years quietly healing itself. Surrounded by islands still too radioactive for the people who once called it home to safely live on again. It's also, if you think about it, one of the stranger naming stories in modern history. A swimsuit worn by hundreds of millions of people around the world, named half as a joke after a nuclear weapons test site whose actual former residents are, to this day, still displaced. Most people who say the word bikini have no idea they're referencing a place where an entire community was exiled 3 times, where fallout drifted onto sleeping children 80 to 100 miles away, and where a promise to finally go home turned into another kind of harm. That's the deleted scene here. Not that the tests happened. That part's in the history books. It's what happened to the people who were already living there before the cameras and the countdown clocks showed up, and what's still, quietly, unresolved about it more than 70 years later. If you haven't already, check out the 60-second version of this story on the channel. And if you want more of the story's history left on the cutting room floor, that's exactly what History Deleted Scenes is for. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.